Good morning. Krystal, if viewers were watching this, what they actually just got from the overhead shot was Sagar's booster seat. You could see it in the overhead shot. So
spilling all the tea
revealed.
Here.
Yeah, welcome to Breaking Points, everyone, where we sit on booster seats so that we can be at the big kids table.
Well, longtime viewers know I have an exceptionally long torso, so everyone has to, literally up their game in order to equalize with me. So it's really my fault, not Sagar's.
Yeah, it's all about Krystal's torso. Well,
Krystal, good way to start the show this morning.
Yes. We do have a big show, though, because the protests are continuing, not just in Los Angeles now. They're spreading around the entire country. New York is seeing some protesting. Atlanta is seeing some protesting. And we have some video clips, both from Los Angeles and around the country, to start the show off with today. And we'll break down the latest updates in the clashes between those cities, particularly, again, between Los Angeles, California, and the Trump administration, because, Krystal, this news cycle is not slowing down.
Yeah, not at all. And I'm interested to get your thoughts. This will be your first chance on the show this week to weigh in. Trump also gave a rather disturbing, in my opinion, speech in front of troops at Fort Bragg yesterday. And it's all kind of part and parcel building up to this big military parade this weekend that happens to be on President Trump's birthday. We've got tanks rolling into D.C. We've got some footage of that, and widespread protests planned for that day as well. Trump saying that those protests are going to be met with force, really not making a distinction between whether they are violent or peaceful protesters. So extremely ominous developments that we can report on this morning. We've also got, speaking of ominous, strange video that was put out by Tulsi. I'm curious your take, Emily, on what is going on there behind the scenes, but she's, warning, rightfully so, about the dire consequences of nuclear war. And of course, comes at a time of dramatic escalation between Ukraine and Russia. So that will be an interesting one to get to. Yeah,
I mean, what's happening right now in Ukraine is also just sort of being buried. I'm not saying wrongfully, but in the domestic news cycle, we have a really crowded news cycle. So we have updates actually on some more deadly attacks that we will cover, especially in that block. And Krystal, Stephen A. Smith on The Daily Show. We have a clip that everyone is definitely going to enjoy. But if you hear Stephen A. Smith on The Daily Show, then you already know that you're going to enjoy the clip in all likelihood. And some more updates from Zohran Mamdani's race in New York City.
Yeah, looks like he has all the momentum. Will it be enough? Big question there, but some interesting new poll numbers. We've also got updates out of Israel. We've got some comments from Greta Thunberg in the wake of her being what President Trump calls kidnapped, which I think is accurate, by Israel and detained there for a while. Some of the other activists are still being held in Israel, but she's speaking out. We also have some new video of the aid, horror scene and new reporting about another aid slaughter. Meanwhile, Mike Huckabee, who is our ambassador to Israel, saying, hey, we're not too big on this whole two-state solution thing. Really significant change in official U.S. government policy. And we're going to be joined this morning by Taryn Steinbrickner-Kaufman. She is an AI expert coming at it from the sort of liberal perspective. And so wanted to get her take on a bunch of developments. In particular, Meta is ponying up a massive amount of cash to try to win the race for AGI, or artificial general intelligence. These are extraordinary developments that, could upend literally all of our lives. So interested to see what Taryn has to say about all of that.
Well, Krystal, we should also mention that BP free, not free gasoline, but that free monthly trial is still going on. If you go over to breakingpoints.com, you can try out the premium experience of Breaking Points as a premium subscriber, free for 1 month. That means you get the second half of the Friday shows and all kinds of other good stuff. The show hits your inbox early and with no breaks every single morning. So if you've ever been curious about trying it out, now is a great time because it's free.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks to everybody who has availed themselves of that offer. One last news update before we jump in. We don't have this as an element in the show, but apparently Elon, I don't know, sometime late last night, tweeted out that he regrets some of the things that he said about President Trump. So I don't know what's going on there.
I don't know what time zone he was in, but it came at 3:04 in the morning, and he said exactly what Krystal just mentioned. I regret some of my posts about President Trump last week, so I guess we'll stay tuned for more.
Yes, more intrigue there, and I'm sure we will continue to cover it. All right, let's go ahead and get to these ICE protests, anti-ICE protests that really at this point are spreading across the country. And we've got some video we can put up on the screen that shows all of the different places where these protests are now going on. You know, to be fair, there had been protests prior to this moment, but they've certainly exploded in size and scope since, things kicked off in LA and since President Trump decided to send in the National Guard and now also deploy the Marines. Word is that the Marines are supposed to actually arrive in LA today. This is the some of the images from LA from yesterday. We've got New York City. You saw Chicago earlier. I know Atlanta had protests as well. I think there are additional protests planned for even more cities today and going into the weekend, including places like Minnesota. You can see Boston here as well. My understanding, Emily, I don't know if you saw anything different this morning, but that LA was relatively quiet last night. The mayor imposed a curfew in the 1 square mile area of the downtown where the protests had been located, centered around that federal government building. So she imposed a curfew. I think anyone who tried to defy it basically got arrested. And, I think that's mostly what went down in LA yesterday. Here you can see protesters, I think, blocking a thoroughfare in Los Angeles from yesterday. And we also can show you fairly disturbing. You're starting to get some of the videos from the police response here. And remember, this is LAPD. This is not the National Guard. And they have certainly had an overwhelming show of force. I heard Sagar and Ryan talking yesterday, Emily, about how difficult it is to tell actually between the ordinary police and National Guardsmen or, Marines, because the local police departments are so kitted out with all of this military gear. This really happened in the wake after the war on terror and the war in Iraq. All of that military equipment started to come home, and basically every major police department throughout the country now looks like they're going in ready for battle. So in any case, I'm going to go ahead and show you this video that is really going viral, showing a woman who reportedly just lives in the area of where these protests were and was trying to get home, and approaches a line of the LAPD cops who are there on the scene doing crowd control, and they pretty much shoot her with some sort of non-lethal projectile, probably a rubber bullet, point blank. Let's go ahead and take a look at a little bit of that.
Well, they're telling her to move, but that's a public sidewalk. They're telling her to move. Watch, if they shoot her. Holy fuck. They're gonna shoot. We're moving! We're moving! Stop! She's injured! Come on, we gotta get across the street.
So shoot her point blank, and she said, I'm just trying to get home. We've seen a few incidences that are like that. We also showed you previously on the show that reporter from Australia who was also hit with a rubber bullet. And yeah, they're not going to kill you. They're less lethal, I think they call them, Emily, but they can do some damage. I've been seeing the injuries come out. In any case, before we get into the latest from Gavin Newsom and Trump's speech and all of that, just wanted to give you a chance to give kind of top line thoughts about what you make of the situation and how this is all unfolding.
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, I tend to think people have, from a political perspective, a hierarchy of priorities. And I think that a lot about Trump when we're analyzing Trump's decisions to do various different things, whether it's, deporting people for anti-Israel op-eds, students for anti-Israel op-eds, or attempting to deport them for anti-Israel op-eds, or, turning the screws to Harvard in novel ways. I tend to think that sometimes it's people don't like the way that Trump approaches a situation, but they still, and this is a mistake I think that some mainstream Democrats make, the average American still, though, doesn't like what the actual status quo policy is less. So it's not that people really, really are, on board with Donald Trump militarizing responses to protests, and they just love it and all of that. I mean, I think a lot of average Americans look at that and really don't like to see the militarization of like local law enforcement, where to the point that you were saying, Sagar and Ryan were discussing, it looks like they're like in Fallujah when they're policing like regular demonstrations. And, you know, far be it for me to defend the LAPD, which I'm not surprised at all by that video that we just showed, which I think was sourced from Reddit, of a woman just getting popped by a rubber bullet, which as she's trying to get home doesn't seem to be a threat to anybody, isn't with a crowd. So yeah, I don't think anybody likes to see those scenes. I honestly, personally think that when we have tens of thousands, I mean, I pulled up this Homeland Security report from last year of the non-detained people on the national docket for ICE at the time. So this was July 21st, 2024. 62,000 people for assault that were non-detained, convicted criminals, convicted of assault, roaming the country. Same thing with dangerous drugs is how they classify it. Sex crimes, homicide, 13,000 people. So I think for a lot of Americans, they are probably more similar to me, aligned on that question of like, there are tens of thousands of people who are not detained, who are convicted criminals, who came into the country, even if they're a drop in the bucket for, you know, I agree with that. I think actually like the Cato Institute statistics are probably correct. The pro-immigration statistics are probably correct, that the average migrant commits crimes at a lesser rate than the average native born. I don't take any issue with those statistics, but I think there are a lot of dangers. I see sanctuary city policies, sanctuary state policies. California basically is a sanctuary state. I see those as subsidies to the cartels, which allow people to go into the country and not be detained, not be, well, I shouldn't say detained, but not be deported. And that allowed a lot of like trafficking of people across the border, and cartels made money off of just about every single one of them. So I don't like how Trump is approaching it. I also really don't like, I think I like less how California has approached it over the course of the last decade, but we likely disagree on that, Krystal.
Well, let's be clear. You are at odds with Stephen Miller on that.
Yes.
Because
yes.
what he explicitly said and has implemented through ICE, he explicitly said to the leaders of ICE, why are you going after criminals? Go to the Home Depot, go to the 7-Elevens. So the priority is not on dealing with, you know, criminals, because the problem is that, yes, of course, there is some number of undocumented immigrants who have committed crimes, been convicted of crimes, been accused of crimes, et cetera. It is not the millions of people, and it would not provide the mass show of force that Stephen Miller wants. So you will find very few people, including myself, in this country who say, yes, we want to keep the convicted criminal undocumented immigrants. The approach that they're taking will make it more difficult to remove the actual dangerous individuals that you're speaking about. And instead, they are targeting the, you know, kids, the elementary school graduation, the day laborer who's out just trying to get a job and has no criminal record whatsoever. That's who they're actually going after. And that is what sparked these protests in LA in particular, which have now really spread across the country. You know, the big picture for me here is we now have a stack of truly authoritarian, terrifying actions being taken here by the Trump administration. I mean, to bring in the National Guard over the objections of local law enforcement to handle some pretty run-of-the-mill protests, the type of thing that you see after, like, you know, a football team wins the Super Bowl or a basketball team wins the NBA finals or whatever. Like, that's where these things started. To call in the National Guard over the objections of the governor, insane, unprecedented, truly, in terms of these dynamics. To bring in the Marines is utterly deranged. Then you have this speech that we're going to show you some clips from here in a moment in front of active duty troops, getting them to cheer for, you know, calling Gavin Newsom a news scum and going after the fake news media. I mean, it's just a hyper partisan speech that you're getting active duty soldiers behind you, that you handpick, by the way, to make sure that they, you know, had the right politics to be behind you to cheer for. Then you add to that this military parade planned for his birthday for this weekend, where he says any protesters, not just violent protesters, any protesters are going to be met with force. And, the pattern is pretty clear here. And then, but you mentioned some of the other actions that have been taken, whether it's the, arresting students for writing an op-ed or, the attacks on me, the attacks on universities. All of this amounts to an extraordinarily dangerous authoritarian power grab. There is nothing, and I'll play the Gavin Newsom SOT in a moment where he makes this, I believe he makes this point in the SOT as well. There is nothing that limits this federalizing of the National Guard to just LA or to just California or to just sanctuary cities or sanctuary states or wherever it is that, you have a policy issue with them. There is no limiting principle on it. And so it certainly seems like part of the goal here is to normalize the idea that it requires the U.S. military in order to just enforce the law. I mean, we showed you the clip of the LAPD. They're not coming in all like hugs and cuddles. They have thousands of cops. The Republicans are supposed to be the ones who are all about law enforcement. Like, they are the ones who are actually supposed to be trained to deal with people who are lawbreakers. And so the notion that you have to bring in Marines who are trained for combat to be deployed against American citizens is, I think, a red line that it's truly un-American and is a red line, in my opinion, that absolutely no one should accept.
I mean, the Marines, we'll see what happens. This could get worse because, to the point that you were making, there's protests now popping up all over the place. There's just not necessarily a limit on the Trump administration's interest in expanding around the country. If anything, I think the Trump administration is eager to have that, and it's because I think the reason, like the political explanation for it, and I don't think we disagree on the politics from the Trump administration's perspective, but they want to look like they're leaning into this. They want to look like Gavin Newsom. They hope Gavin Newsom gets as much airtime as he can, and we actually have a clip of Gavin Newsom giving a primetime television address last night, and it's gotten a decent bit of play just over the last 12 hours or so. So let's actually go ahead and roll EX3 to get a taste of how Gavin Newsom addressed people last night.
This is about all of us. This is about you. California may be first, but it clearly will not end here. Other states are next. Democracy is next. Democracy is under assault before our eyes. This moment we have feared has arrived.
And Krystal, before we get to the Fort Bragg speech, which we also, as you mentioned, have clips from, I just want to say my frustration with that is the sanctuary state policies are why it's hard to get the tens of thousands of convicted criminals, not even people with charges, but just convicted criminals. That's why it's actually hard for law enforcement to do it, is that they're able to be in California and in these places. Like, it does genuinely make it really hard. And so I feel like what would be really de-escalatory is for Gavin Newsom to do what Muriel Bowser has done here in D.C. and start walking some of those policies back. But now it's just everyone's kind of has dug in because the Trump administration responded in a way that Gavin Newsom politically is responding to in this way, and not entirely without reason. They're calling for his arrest, so you can see why Gavin Newsom would react as he did. But we're absolutely no closer to solving the legitimate problem. And many such cases, I guess, such as the nature of American politics in 2025.
Well, I'm pretty sure Texas is not a sanctuary state. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No.
And they're using the same type of tactics there. The same type of protests are being sparked. And there is a
couple cities are. I think Houston is, but yeah.
And there are quite a large number, a relatively equivalent population, per capita number of undocumented immigrants in Texas as there are in California. So, fine to debate sanctuary city and sanctuary state policies. I disagree. I think it's important and actually is good for elimination of crime and violence, to make it so that immigrants feel like they can go to the authorities without fearing like they're going to, break up their family and be deported out of the country. Fair to criticize, to have a debate about that, legitimate policy argument, not legitimate to send in Marines against American citizens who are protesting at a time when, the governor, when their protests are relatively limited, not out of control in some way that the LAPD can't handle. And again, zooming out as part of a broader authoritarian crackdown and power grab against dissent overall in this country. And, I think part of the reason why they're now using National Guard, so, these active duty soldiers with semi-automatic weapons, they're using them in ICE raids now in California, I think is to present an image of criminality, because when you see this force coming in, you assume this must be for some, super bad guy, super villain, to create that impression, even though who you're really going after is like, again, like a day laborer at Home Depot, or, a mom with an American citizen kid, and, those types of more sympathetic cases. So by militarizing the response and having that look of the masked ICE agents surrounded by the kitted up National Guardsmen, you can create a perception that these must be hardened criminals they're going after, when that is, we know, not the case. I mean, even the guys they sent to CCOT to rot in a slave labor camp for life, the vast majority of them were not criminals in any respect, had no arrest record whatsoever. And you have to assume the reason that they did that is because there just aren't the number of undocumented criminals that they want to project to the nation. So, I think Newsom, who I am no fan of in general, has actually done an excellent job, and a very, most Democrats are so slow on their feet in terms of responding and engaging, and they're only going on the mainstream outlets and only doing these prepackaged things. He gave this primetime address, which I thought was relatively effective, but he's also been out there mixing it up on Twitter. He's done a bunch of different podcasts. He's been very aggressive about combating narratives in real time in a way that, listen, I think his star had really fallen. I think he'd really misread the moment early in Trump 2.0. And there's just no doubt that this is hugely elevating for him with the Democratic base, and, definitely makes him more of a contender. Not that that's the most important thing right now whatsoever. But we've mentioned now a couple times, Trump went to Fort Bragg and gave this speech in front of the active duty soldiers that are there. Hyper partisan, hyper political, typical like Trump rally speech, which, I know nobody cares about like the way things used to be or the norms, but this is something that would have been completely unthinkable, out of bounds whatsoever. Like the idea of soldiers even like overtly expressing partisan political beliefs was something that was completely out of bounds until, really the Trump moment. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of how that went down.
And before going further, I want to say a few words about the situation in Los Angeles, California. Have you heard of the place? Where I've deployed thousands of National Guard troops and hundreds of Marines to protect federal law enforcement from the attacks of a vicious and violent mob. And some of the radical left, they say, oh, that's not nice. Well, if we didn't do it, there wouldn't be a Los Angeles. It'd be burning today, just like their houses were burning a number of months ago. Generations of Army heroes did not shed their blood on distant shores only to watch our country be destroyed by invasion and third world lawlessness here at home, like is happening in California. As Commander-in-Chief, I will not let that happen. It's never going to happen. In Los Angeles, the governor of California, the mayor of Los Angeles, they're incompetent, and they paid troublemakers, agitators, and insurrectionists. They're engaged in this willful attempt to nullify federal law and aid the occupation of the city by criminal invaders. That's what it is. Very simply, we will liberate Los Angeles and make it free, clean, and safe again. It's happening very quickly. But they proudly carry the flags of other countries, but they don't carry the American flag. They only burn it. Did you see a lot of the flags being burned? They weren't being burned by people from our country or from people that love our country. People that burn the American flag should go to jail for 1 year. That's what they should be doing.
That last piece there, something he has repeated multiple times, and has been deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but I'm sure is if you poll it, is fairly popular to criminalize the burning of the American flag. But in any case, Emily, what do you make of the dynamics of the president there giving this hyper-partisan speech and, eliciting cheers and boos from the active duty soldiers there at Fort Bragg?
I mean, I agree with what you said as we were queuing up the video, that it's something if Barack Obama did it, if even John McCain did it, nobody would be happy. To some extent, because it's Donald Trump, it's something that we're numb to. And I also think not without reason, because he's still, at least for now, an exception to how he handles a lot of these situations. I mean, even I can't envision J.D. Vance doing anything quite like that. I can't envision a Democrat who I think would do anything quite like that. But we don't really know what happens to these norms after Donald Trump is no longer president. So it's just one of those situations. Like I don't know if this is something that we are still in this like temporary Trump moment, or if this is something that continues afterwards.
I think that's a good point, because perhaps at this moment, he's the only one who can get away with this, treating the military as his own personal army, effectively. And that's certainly the way that he wants them to behave. That's certainly the way people want to perceive them. And maybe now, at this moment, because he's so outrageous in so many regards, he's the only one who can even remotely get away with that. But once that bridge is crossed, and that approach to, the military and deploying the military against U.S. citizens and routinely using, Marines for law enforcement in American cities, once that sort of thing becomes normalized, then it doesn't just stay with Trump. There's a bridge that's crossed and a genie that's out of the bottle that's very hard, if not impossible, to put back in. And I think that's what is so incredibly alarming to me and others about this moment. It just give you a little bit of backstory. Jane Coaston was able to obtain the sort of memo that went out about how they picked these guys to be standing there behind Trump. She got this note that says they need everyone seated by this time. Soldiers sitting in the bleachers are to be fit and not look fat. Classic. Soldiers in the bleachers will not be allowed to have water, so they must hydrate. No colored patches. If any soldiers have political views that are in opposition to the current administration and they don't want to be in the audience and they need to speak with their leadership and get swapped out. Basically, they don't want soldiers in the audience rolling their eyes or shaking their head in disagreement, etc. So they basically put out like a casting call here to get the guys with the right political views who are going to be loyal to Trump, who aren't going to be rolling their eyes or shaking their head or, not enthusiastic enough, not cheering and laughing and applauding at the laugh lines and the cheer lines, etc. And so that was how they, were able to create this moment, this authoritarian strongman moment for President Trump, where it appears like the military is serving as his sort of personal marching band, cheerleaders, his force directly, rather than the servants and protectors of the American people. There were also, I mentioned before, he's got this military parade coming up this weekend in D.C. That is going to be a very, that's going to be a troubling moment, because he announced in the Oval Office yesterday that any protests, which there are already protests planned for Saturday, for that day, that any protests will be met with force, making no distinction between peaceful and violent protesters. Let's go ahead and take a listen to that.
Be there a little bit, but it seems to be getting less and less, because they're going there and they're met with a very heavy force. And if they weren't, you would have that city right now would be on fire. It would be burning down. The rest of it, what's left over, because the other fire was started because they wouldn't allow water into L.A. They wouldn't allow water into California because they had it all shifted out to the Pacific Ocean, and I turned it around. called him up to tell him, got to do a better job. He's doing a bad job, causing a lot of death and a lot of potential death. If we didn't send out the National Guard, and last night we gave him a little additional help, you would have, Los Angeles would be burning right now.
In reaction to these large-scale ICE operations in Los Angeles, should people expect to see similar operations in the rest of the country?
Yeah.
And will similar protests see similar response?
As you know, we're moving murderers out of our country that were put here by Biden or the auto pen. The auto pen really did it. A very simple rule of engagement. If they're dangerous, if they're throwing concrete or bricks, if they're spitting in the face of the police or whoever's in front of them, if they're punching people, if they're doing all of the things that you see done for the last 3 nights, that I would say is engagement.
So that was actually more specifically about what's going on in California. I think we have the SOT for the next block about the military parade where he says, protesters will be met with overwhelming force. But, he's making these claims saying, LA, California would be on fire if we hadn't sent the National Guardsmen. The reality is most of the National Guardsmen that have been sent, I think it's like 4,000 at this point, have not been given orders, are not really doing much of anything. In fact, local law enforcement, the LAPD, is having to divert resources to protect the National Guardsmen who've been given no orders and nothing to do, which underscores the fact, even Trump himself has said that things have quieted down in LA. Of course, he wants to take credit for it, but underscores the fact that, as Newsom and Karen Bass have been saying, the scope of the protests, which were largely within 1 square mile, a few city blocks in downtown LA, were well within the capability of the LAPD to handle. And, bringing in the National Guard did nothing but inflame tensions and make the protests much larger than they would have been otherwise.
So also to the point, Krystal, about where this goes from here, let's put A2 on the screen. This is an indication that the protests are going to continue to spread to other cities. It's a report from NBC News. We should also go through here A3. This is Jennifer Griffin of Fox News noting that the 700 Marines ordered to help in LA have not yet arrived to help control the riots. The Marines will remain at Seal Beach, south of LA, and will be undergoing training for a few more days, which, Krystal, a few more days of training in a situation like this sounds like a delay that's intentional to make it look like the Marines were involved without ever actually putting the Marines in the situation, because after a few days of training, which is already rather nebulous, I don't know that they actually are going to find a situation where they put the Marines in Los Angeles. So that's an interesting one to watch as well. It almost is like Pete Hegseth wanted to respond to Donald Trump's suggestion and said, okay, we've got the Marines on it, and they're undergoing their training for civil unrest, and then the riot's over.
Yeah, well, the reporting I saw is they're supposed to arrive today, so we'll see. I hope that your analysis is the correct one. It also just underscores the case, Marines are not trained for crowd control. They are trained for offensive combat missions, not to go in and act in a law enforcement capacity against American citizens. So, like I said, what I saw is that they're meant to arrive today. We'll see what happens there and what use they're put to.
And if they're already arriving after the mayor has implemented a curfew and
the protests have basically quieted down. Now, I do think there's another major flashpoint this weekend with the protests, and ICE raids are continuing. What I read in the LA Times this morning is they're actually expanding outside of the city into more rural areas, going after farm laborers and things of that nature. So the ICE raids are not going to stop. So the provocation that originally sparked the protests are not going to end either. So certainly the conflagration, I think it's way too early to say that is over. There's a lot of reasons to still be really concerned about where this is all headed. Now, there has been some legal action that we wanted to update you on. Gavin Newsom, put this up on the screen, filed an emergency motion to block Trump's, I believe, and he agrees, illegal deployment of Marines and National Guard in LA. He was asking for a decision to be made on this and a TRO to be issued within 2 hours. The judge said, no, we're not going to issue a TRO in the time frame that you want. Instead, a hearing is set for Thursday to consider the merits of the lawsuit here. And, in terms of the legality, Trump has not invoked the Insurrection Act, which would give him much more broad powers. Instead, he used these, it's called Title 10 powers that seem on their face to require the consent and for the governor to actually be the one that issues the order to federalize the National Guard. I mean, the deployment of the Marines, I don't even know what legal pretext they are using to justify any sort of use of the Marines in a law enforcement setting in LA. So that seems to be even more tenuous, but we'll see what the courts have to say about all of this.
Well, Krystal, I was going to say,
Emily.
actually, we have A5. This is the next element to put on the screen. This is from the San Francisco Chronicle reporting that says, we obtained a memo from DHS Secretary Kristi Noem asking DOD Secretary Pete Hegseth to grant soldiers the authority to detain or arrest, quote unquote, lawbreakers in LA. This would be a step towards the Trump administration invoking the Insurrection Act, experts say. To the question that you just raised, are they sort of trying to pave the path to the Insurrection Act with some of this? I think is an open question as well, especially with the reporting and actually what we saw last night about expansions into other cities.
I think it's quite likely. And A6, Stephen Miller has been really leading the sort of propaganda charge. And he says here that this is the definition of insurrection. LA and California leadership demand the right to illegally import unlimited foreigners into America to control America's entire immigration policy by fiat. And if they are not so permitted, they will allow mobs to target ICE with impunity. I mean, this is just absurd. First of all, we've had court rulings at this point. Stephen Miller's always using the language of invasion. We've had multiple courts rule at this point in the context of Alien Enemies Act. This is not an invasion. This is, absurd. Like, this is way beyond the bounds of what that language would imply. And it's not like Newsom and Bass were standing in the way of ICE raids. He makes it sound like they were blocking law enforcement, the ICE from doing anything and going in and, deporting immigrants. That's just not the case whatsoever. But I think the important thing here is the use of the word insurrection and the attempt to lay the groundwork, the rhetorical groundwork to build up to an invocation of the Insurrection Act, which I've been pointing out. On day one, Trump had signed an executive order saying, hey, check into, it was Kristi Noem and a couple other, I think Hegseth, I don't remember, a couple other officials. Hey, do an analysis and tell me whether I should invoke the Insurrection Act now. So he's been looking for an excuse to do this. They've also got reporting now that he's been from the jump looking for a pretext in order to send in federalized National Guard, send in troops, potentially invoke the Insurrection Act. So I certainly think it is very likely that we are building up to exactly that, especially as protests build in cities, in blue cities across the country in particular.
You pulled out this quote from a Wall Street Journal report yesterday. This is A7 basically it shows, I'll read it. In Coral Springs, Florida, at least 8 agents in tactical gear, shields, and rifles surrounded a home with guns, raced to arrest a father with no criminal history. In Irvine, California, ICE agents drove a phalanx of military vehicles in the Orange County suburb to arrest a person, though not for illegal immigration. They were seeking a resident's son who had allegedly posted flyers alerting neighbors to the presence of ICE agents. Krystal, that goes to the point that you were making earlier in the block about actually whether some of these excessive and arguably incompetent instances of trying to subdue either non-criminal aliens or American citizens, does that actually hurt ultimately the effort to take convicted criminals out of the country, for the Trump administration to take tens of thousands of convicted criminals out of the country? It's certainly a hell of an anecdote there from the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, I mean, posting flyers is clearly protected First Amendment activity. And so you're sending in a phalanx of military vehicles to go after someone's son who posted some flyers. I mean, this is insane. And I think the first instance was with regard to, it was in Florida, again, not a sanctuary state, but they felt that the numbers, Stephen Miller felt that the numbers were too low when they were largely focusing on, trying to find criminal undocumented immigrants. So they are taking much more aggressive tactics. As we've discussed before, part of the plan here is to be so insane, so cruel, so over the top that you scare people into self-deporting themselves. That was the point of CCOT. There are also plans now that have been reported out to send thousands more immigrants, largely actually European immigrants, to Guantanamo Bay. And so, this is the goal. And it ties in also with the quote unquote big, beautiful bill, which would provide vastly more resources to ICE, both in terms of manpower and in terms of partnering with private prison contractors to build out these mass detention facilities. So, these shows of force are very intentional, even though they are in certain instances unconstitutional and wildly unnecessary. Again, I do think part of that is when you have this show of huge numbers of agents coming in fully kitted out in military vehicles, with their military gear, the public perception and assumption is that they must be going after a criminal, even when it's a dad with no criminal record, even when it's a son for posting flyers. So this is, this imagery and this approach, it's all very intentional. I also find it really disturbing the way that the ICE agents have taken to oftentimes wearing plain clothes and fully masking and obscuring their face. And I think that is, deeply un-American and deeply disturbing, and has led to some instances already. There have been a couple instances I've seen where people have posed as ICE agents and in order to themselves commit crimes. The other thing that I think it's important to note is they've diverted resources in the FBI and other, law enforcement agencies within the federal government to this mass deportation effort, which takes them off of the ability to go after other criminal activity. So, back to your original point about what you would like to see happen and how you'd like to see this focus on, getting people who have committed crimes and who are undocumented immigrants out of the country. That is not at all, they do not at all have a focus on criminals, whether it's undocumented or otherwise. Instead, the focus really is on creating the sense of terror and horror among the entire immigrant community so that people will themselves self-deport so that their base will get the red meat that they want. And also, I think partly to try to, to trigger a reaction from the public that justifies even more of an authoritarian crackdown, which is exactly what we're seeing unfold right now. It's
a very frightening state of affairs because I actually am sympathetic to a lot of these agents, like a run-of-the-mill, and we likely disagree on this, run-of-the-mill ICE agent who, has a family, is trying to provide for them, and is getting, videotaped and shot all over social media, all of that, but it's part of the job at this point. And so it's one of the frustrating things I think about the Trump era in general is that the responses to a lot of, I think, legitimate problems and problems with, I would say like sympathetic, at least from my perspective on the right problems, the reaction is, it does go, and sometimes, like you use the phrase anti-American. Yeah, I mean, I do think having masked law enforcement officers pull people off the streets is, and some of them have been citizens, by the way. We've seen videos of that. So, it's a frightening state of affairs when you have people who are in the country illegally, not even wanting to show up to the court hearings because they're deporting people at the court hearings, which again is another sort of like, I get it if it's your job to deport people who are overstaying visas and are in the country illegally, but then people don't even participate in the process anymore because they're afraid of being deported. So it's setting up as a response to a very legitimate crisis, I think, created by the Biden administration. It's setting us up for a lot of unrest. I feel like actually, Krystal, this really is just the beginning, but we've earned a laugh, so I think we should watch the Waymos fleeing.
Yes. Waymos are exiting LA Here they are. Waymo halt service in downtown LA amid ICE protests. The Waymos are fleeing the scene after a new and novel protest tactic of summoning Waymos. I didn't even realize, to be honest with you, that Waymo use was as widespread as it is in California. But to be honest, that's kind of interesting in and of itself.
So
but anyway,
the protest tactic is summoning the Waymos to
light them on fire.
So it's kind of funny.
It is kind of funny.
Kind of funny.
I don't know if this was on air or off air, but what I was saying is like, listen, if we have an organized war against the robots, I'm here for it. Like, yes, let's do that. But if we're, just doing this as like, I am one who am not particularly sympathetic to like the usefulness of setting a Waymo on fire and jumping on top of it with a Mexican flag. Look, yep. I get it. I'm not like, it's not a moral issue, but I don't think that it is. You can see the way the Trump administration has like jumped on these images and absolutely loves them. So it's not the most helpful thing in the world.
No, but the Waymos fleeing in unison, I think it's just helpful from a levity perspective because we could all use it at this point.
All right, guys, 2 quick things. Number 1, by popular demand, we are bringing back the monthly subscription. Number 2, you can get a month free, Ryan, by putting in that promo code BPFree at breakingpoints.com.
Yeah, and I think the most important reason to become a premium subscriber is just as an act of support for the show. It helps us do what we're doing. But if you're curious what the benefits are of doing it, take the free month, and you'll see you get the AMAs, you get the second half of the Friday show, you get you get the full show emailed to you earlier. It makes your life much better. Do it for a month at breakingpoints.com. BPFree is a promo code. And if after a month your life isn't dramatically improved, you can just cancel. If it is, it's just $10 a month.
There you go.